Hello everyone, Inquisitive Own here, and for the last week and a half, I've been doing a deep dive into the Necron faction for Warhammer 40k. I have been a fan of the Necrons. I've played them since 8th edition. I have a over 2,000 point army of Necrons. I thought I knew their lore, but in this deep dive that I did, I ended up falling in love with them again because they're just so cool. There's so much irony in their creation or their transformation into Necrons. But there's also a lot of gray area. And as you know, I love gray area because it allows us to speculate as fans of the hobby and fans of the faction. And so I decided to do a deep dive based on information that I found out or theories that I have and speculations that I have as well. Before we get into the deep dive, I just want to let those who are new to the channel know that this is not going to be an introduction to a faction. This is not an introduction to the Necrons. This is not a video that I recommend if you don't know what Necrons are. This is a video that's targeted toward people who have an idea about what the Necrons are and a little bit of their lore. Okay, so I just wanted to get that out of the way. Also, I do not have a professional setup, and so you might hear things in the background. I'm sorry. This is just real amateur stuff. This is just me at my house recording, doing videos about things that I'm passionate about. All right, so without any more warnings, without further delay, let's get into it. So I anticipate that this is going to be a rather long video, and if it's not going to be long, it's going to be rather jumbled. And so I've decided to kind of do a layout of what I'm going to be going over in the video. This basically is the introduction, but some of the things I plan to go over in this video are Necrontyr society. Meaning that, you know, the Necrons, before they were the Necrons, were the Necrontyr. And we don't really know much about their society. So in this section of the video, I'm going to be making a lot of speculations and guesses as to what it could have been based on information that we're given now. And then I'm going to go over the expansion, which is what I call the moment that the Necrons were able to escape their world and travel into the galaxy and divide the galaxy into dynastic territories. And then I'm going to go into the Satan. I think this is probably my favorite part of this video because, like, I feel like there's an essential misunderstanding about the Satan, and if we are technical about it, we would realize that, you know, how most people view the Satan is not really how they are. And so yeah, that's what I'm going to go over in that part of the video. Then I'm going to go over the Necrons. So there's a clear difference between the Necrontyr and the Necrons. There are a lot of similarities, but there are clear differences as well, and so I'm going to go over some of that. And then at the end, I had a few questions that came up when I was doing this deep dive that I want to ask and answer at the end of the video. All right, so that's what this video is going to be. Yeah, I just wanted to give you guys a layout of what I'm going to be doing or what I'm going to be saying in this video to manage expectations, you know? All right, so let's get into it. The Necrons are all that remains of the Necrontyr Xenos species. The Necrontyr existed billions of years before humanity came into existence in the Warhammer 40k setting. In fact, they existed before any of the other known and active factions of the 40k setting and are technically one of the oldest known Xenos species in the galaxy. The Necrontyr species had its beginnings on one of the many worlds in the Halo Stars region of the galaxy. While Imperial cartographers have indicated that there's a specific area of space called the Halo Stars, in actuality the Halo Stars refers to all of the stars found at the edge of the Milky Way galaxy. These stars are ancient beyond comprehension, and it is believed that the stars in the Halo region of the galaxy are intermixed with dark matter that existed at the galaxy's edge. The nature of dark matter, it being that it does not absorb or reflect light, therefore making it invisible, makes this area of space both dangerous and mysterious. Like, imagine stars that blink in and out of existence, or not seeing stellar bodies until it's too late to turn away from them. Explorators and rogue traders hesitate to venture into this region of space, and few who have done so have returned to tell the tale. The worlds that encircle these stars are said to be as peculiar and mysterious as the various life forms that could exist on them. Indeed, new and previously unknown xenospecies abound in the Halo stars region, to a degree that only the bravest, or the most desperate, or the most curious enter into that area of space. And that's just the modern setting. Imagine how it was billions of years before humanity. The Necrontyr themselves came into existence under the baleful light of a halo star, and they were a peculiar species indeed. In appearance, we don't have much information regarding how the Necrontyr actually looked, but if we use the current Necron artwork and models, we can deduct that they were tall, at least 8 to 9 feet tall, humanoid beings with rather long faces. Some artists have depicted them as being thin and sickly with grayish skin tone due to the effects of their star's solar wind and radiation, and I think that might be accurate, but then again, that's only a speculation. The most that we can do is kind of like a visual archaeology by looking at the Necron models and looking at the lore. What we do know is that the entirety of the Necrontyr peoples existed on one planet, and for a long period in their history, their planet was a death sentence for them. Their planet's star emitted so much radiation, and the conditions of their planets were so inadequate to protect them from these things that Necron's existence was defined by the variety of cancers and other sicknesses which doomed them to extremely short lives when they were Necrontyr. Death was such a prominent aspect of Necrontyr society that the majority of the structures on the world's surface were catacombs and mortuary tributes, both for the dead and for those who would soon be dead. Because they lived in essentially a necropolis, it would appear that the Necrontyr have accepted their short lives, but this could not be further from the reality of their situation. For some reason, they wished to live longer than what the conditions of their homeworld limited them to. And I say for some reason because, to me, if all the Necrontyr ever knew were short lives, then why would they want to live any longer than what they knew? How could they even know that it was possible to ever live longer lives? How can they miss something that they never had? This line of thinking makes me speculate that the Necrontyr did not always live short lives, and that conditions on their homeworld changed drastically to the point where they started living shorter lives and they couldn't really do anything about it. We know that there were trees on the world because of tools that the Necrons used being designed in the form of tools that they used to use on their homeworld, which were made of wood. We also know that they were beasts of burden. So we also know that there was plant life on this planet. We also know that there were animals and other creatures on this planet. But besides that, we don't really have much information about everything else involving the Necrontyr homeworld. The desire to live longer pushed the species forward through brief generations to the point where they were able to develop advanced technology with which they could use to escape their homeworld and the baleful energies of their star. According to the source that you read, it also says that the Necrontyr tried to alter themselves scientifically, but they just could not. They tried to alter themselves to the point where they would be able to survive in this radiation that the sun was beaming down on their planet, but they just could not. And so the only other option was for them to leave, and that's where their scientific efforts went, and it was successful. They were able to create ships. It's here that I'd like to note that necrodermis, the living metal that has become synonymous with the Necrons, was created while the Necrontyr were still on their homeworld and were still flesh and blood creatures. However, at this time, they only used it to create the ships that they would use to leave their homeworld. They had advanced technologically to the point where they had also created stasis crypts for themselves so that they would be able to survive the long distances of travel that they would need to make in order to find new homes. Just because they escaped their homeworld did not mean that they lived longer, like immediately after they left the atmosphere. They still suffered from short lives and the ailments they did before, which they likely inherited at this point. For this reason, I speculate that the early stasis crypts that they were using in their ships were continually used when they settled onto new worlds and would later serve as the archetypes for the tomb world systems. This expansion into the galaxy would be a turning point in the history of the Necrontyr for many reasons. But before we go into those reasons, I want to go into the societal structure of the Necrontyr because it will help to give context to things I'll go over later in this video. There are certain things that we can deduct from how Necrons are organized now, because so much of how they are organized now is inspired by the traditions of the old Necrontyr dynasty, right? And so this following section of the video, there's not going to be much information to back it up, but it's going to be deductive reasoning and things of that nature, and assumption and theory. Okay, so I just wanted to warn you guys that this is not really lore. This can't really be backed up, but there are certain aspects of the lore that kind of support these ideas. All right, so concerning Necrontyr societal structure, there was a strict hierarchy in the Necrontyr society. Necrontyr peoples were organized into dynasties. These dynasties were led by a royal court, which was a ruling class of nobles. And the ruling class of nobles, the lords, the overlords, and the advisors were led by a figure called the pharaoh. The pharaoh was like a king or queen of their dynasties. But the hierarchy went up further still. The governing body of the Necrontyr peoples as a whole was called the Triarch. The Triarch was composed of the pharaohs of 3 different dynasties, and one of the pharaohs served as the leader of the Triarch and the ultimate ruler of the Necrontyr. The leader of the Triarch was called the Silent King. The Silent King was comparable to the emperor of the Necrontyr. He was the ruler, he or she was the ruler of the Necrontyr people. The title of office was named as such because the Silent King, due to what we can only assume to be tradition, only spoke through the other 2 pharaohs of the Triarch, meaning when he wanted to say something, the others spoke for him, which is weird, or him or her. Position as one of the Triarch was usually inherited, but due to the relatively short lives of the Necrontyr, most dynasties had pharaohs who served as part of the Triarch at some point in time in their history. In a similar fashion, the pharaohs of the individual Necron dynasties also ruled for relatively brief time spans and was an inherited position. The symbol of the Triarch was a stylized ankh comparable to the ankh of ancient Terra. Ironically, the symbol of the governing body of a species of short-lived Xenos was a symbol most associated with the symbol of eternal life. Each Necron dynasty had their own stylized ankh as well, designed by their pharaohs. From bits and pieces of information available to us, we know that the Necrontyr were at one point in time polytheistic and believed in multiple gods, with one primary death god and a few other gods in their belief system. More irony that their gods were centered on death and the stars, especially when their mortality was defined by death caused by their homeworld's star. As I said earlier, this bit is not supported by any lore that we have available so far, but I am just speculating. There's no canon lore to back this up, but a lot of Necron styles of organization likely mirrored original Necrontyr ideals, but to a larger scale. From this perspective, the dynasties on the Necrontyr world were possibly organized into bands of land, right? Like, let's say if we were to visualize it, it's like a circle with 3 concentric circles inside of it, right? And the outer ring of that circle would be the fringe lands, right? Which would serve as spaces in between the dynasties and the abode of lower class citizens. And then closer to the center would be the core lands, which would serve as cities of dynastic territories with higher class citizens. And then there were in the middle would be the crown lands, which would be the abode of the pharaohs and the ruling class. As I said, this is only a speculation, but it's a speculation based on a mirror of what the Necrons would do when they carved out the galaxy into dynastic territories. They would have crown worlds, they would have core worlds, and they would have fringe worlds of the Necrontyr dynasties later in their future. And so I assume that this was reflected by something that was happening on their homeworld, only on one planet. And so that's my idea. They had territories, and these territories were concentric circles. And the closer you got to the center, the higher up the status of the citizens in the areas. Only some of the roles that exist in Necron organization existed in Necrontyr society. Much of the royal court existed, meaning lords, overlords, advisors, and so on. The regular citizenry of the dynasties made up the majority of the Necrontyr, who served as the subjects of the royal court's will. The lives of Necrontyr were so brief that it's hard to imagine that they would ever fight over much during this time of being on their homeworld. But if history can be said to repeat itself in Warhammer 40k setting, I would speculate that any conflicts between dynasties that were on the homeworld were likely fought over dynastic territory, the assets and the resources of said dynasty in service to the ruling nobles, the royal families of the Necrontyr. In moments of conflict, the ordinary citizens of the dynasty would become the warriors of the dynasty, the regular line troops of the Necrontyr dynastic armies, which were similar to the Necron warriors that we know of, just without the Goth weapons. However, the later existence of the Necron immortal makes me question what exactly made the royal court of the Necrontyr society. We know that royal positions were often inherited, which suggests the importance of lineage to the Necrontyr. This got me thinking, what if the hierarchy of the Necrontyr was based on genetics? I know that came from left field, but let me explain. So, after biotransference, the metal bodies of the Necrons varied greatly in appearance. Of course, this could have been designed to purposely exaggerate the grandeur of the royal courts of the dynasties, especially when it comes to the model of the Silent King. There's no Necron that was that tall, and just because he was the Pharaoh doesn't mean that Pharaohs were that tall. Like the Silent King probably had like a custom body made for him where it kind of exuded his grandeur, right? But like, what if the physical builds of the Necrontyr or the Necrons actually reflected or imitated the actual build of a Necrontyr? Not literally, like I said. I don't mean to suggest that the Necrontyr had shoulder blade crests that went way above their head, or that the Silent King was like 12 feet tall. But what I am saying is that after biotransference, the beings that had the most free will as Necrontyr not only seemed to retain some intelligence after biotransference, but had more fuller bodies and figures of the Necrons. Those who had less free will as Necrontyr retained very little intelligence as Necrons and also had relatively pathetic builds in comparison. As a purely visual representation of this idea, if we compare a Necron warrior to a Necron immortal, their quote-unquote physiology is different. Immortals are bigger, they're taller, they're wider, they have wider shoulders and thicker legs, etc. The higher up the hierarchy you go, the bigger and more defined the Necron, and perhaps this is mirrored a physiological difference amongst the Necrontyr. This genetic difference likely reinforced the class-based structure that ensured that the royal families remained royal and that the royal bloodlines remained strong. It says in the 8th edition Necron Codex that Necron warriors were not warriors as Necrontyr, but citizens of lesser status, which I think reinforces this theory of mine. Consequently, it wouldn't be too extreme to think that based on status, you were either further or closer from the core lands, or the crown world, the crown lands. So like if you were let's say a regular citizen, you'd probably be on the fringe lands. If you were of a higher status, you'd be in the core lands, and if you were the royalty, you'd be in the crown lands. But like I said, it's speculation, but I think it makes sense because this is exactly what they would do when they would take over systems. The outer worlds of their systems would be fringe worlds, and they would just be outposts, basically. They collected information, they collected resources, and it was basically just outposts that lords looked over. So I'm making a correspondence between past and present, and I'm trying to infer, like, it could have been designed by things in the past just on one world as opposed to many worlds. And while we're talking about class and Necrontyr units and hierarchy and genetics and all of that stuff, the Necrontyr equivalent of certain Necron units could not have existed during the time before the expansion and actually developed later. And this is a point that I'm going to elaborate on later in this video. Figures such as Crypteks, the technologists of the Necrontyr, likely still existed as Necrontyr when they were still flesh and blood, and were likely responsible for the technological advancement of the species, like they continue to be after Biotransference. It would be the Crypteks who created Necrodermis, the living metal which they built ships from and stasis crypts with, which would see the species spreading throughout the galaxy. Assuming that if one dynasty had access to a particularly successful Cryptek, they could advance much more than the other dynasties, I'm assuming that the Triarch made the Crypteks into their own guild or order while on their homeworld, this order which did not belong to any specific dynasty, so that all Necrontyr pharaohs and royal houses would have access to them and to their knowledge. This is likely why the Crypteks would later become a pan-galactic conclave of their own, serving as advisors to the pharaohs and noble houses instead of being part of any one dynasty. And this is the thing, like, I'm not saying that each dynasty didn't have its own Crypteks. Of course they did, but the Crypteks, their loyalty was more to the guild than to their dynasty, so they probably helped out other dynasties as well besides their own. But that's, like I said, merely an assumption, and assumption based on mirroring how the Necrons are now, but just in a smaller scale. I think it's also important to note that most of the ranged Gauss weaponry of the Necrons were likely not created until around or after the expansion, at or around Biotransference. While they were an advancing species technologically, the Necrontyr did not yet have the knowledge of how to create the weaponry that uses Gauss. So for all intent and purpose, the Necrontyrs developed, as most species do, from low technology to high technology over long periods of time. You know what's an interesting fact that I discovered when I was reading into the lore of the Necrons? It's unknown how many Necron dynasties existed before the Great Expansion when they were still on their homeworld. At a very minimum, we know that there were 3 dynasties because the Triarch was composed of pharaohs of 3 dynasties. However, we don't know if all the dynasties that we know in our current lore existed previously. This is something up for speculation because later Necron history is literally riddled with the assets of one dynasty being taken over by another pharaoh or another royal house in the creation of new dynasties. Undoubtedly, in the wars of succession, some of the smaller dynasties were destroyed, and while some were actually being created when nobles split from their original dynasties to make their own dynasties. So it's like, we don't really know how many of the Necron dynasties that we know now actually existed on the homeworld, or when they came into existence. And honestly, that might be another video I might make. I might make a video going over the Necron dynasties and trying to figure out when they came into existence. Just because we don't know how long ago the ones that we know now have existed. There's even questioning about the Zarekin dynasty, which is a Silent King's dynasty. Like, people are questioning whether or not his dynasty is his own because they don't know where they came from, you know? So I think that might be a video. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like me to make a video going over the dynasties and going over the information. But that's all that I could gather from Necrontyr society and Necrontyr physiology and just organization. A lot of it is just mirroring what the Necrons did on a cosmic scale on a global scale on their homeworld, and just really being practical about certain correspondences like Necrontyr, the equivalent of Necron warriors and immortals being something that existed during the time of them being on their homeworld. But then there are other units that could not have possibly been around during that time. And so with that part of the video being done, we're going to move on now to the expansion. The expansion into the rest of the galaxy and freedom from their oppressive star saw the Necrontyr dynasties carving the Milky Way galaxy into dynastic territories. The homeworld of the Necrons was not abandoned, and we know this because of what happened when the Necrontyr fought the Old Ones for the first time. However, it likely remained a seat of power for the Triarch, even as the dynasties of the pharaohs in it expanded out into the galaxy light years away. With the creation of Necrodermis, perhaps the planet itself became more survivable in shelters made of it. The expansion is when problems began in the Necrontyr species. So like some of the dynasties felt that the Triarch limited them in their potential and wished to remove themselves from under the rule of the Triarch and carve their own destiny. Others remained completely loyal to the Triarch. This meant that the wars of succession were inevitable. Infighting started to happen amongst the Necrontyr dynasties as some fought for the Triarch and others fought against it. Apparently, from the information we have, those who supported the Triarch were in the majority. So there was only a few dynasties that were like, we want to break away and make our own fate. Seeing that if the fighting continued, the Necrontyr would wipe themselves out in only a few generations, the Silent King at the time, who was not Serac, by the way, just the Silent King, the ultimate pharaoh at the time, struggled to find a solution that would unite the Necrontyr peoples again. However, the answer to this problem would make itself present. So during their expansion, the Necrontyr encountered a variety of early, now unknown Xenos species, which they combated in order to claim their dynastic territories. Xenos which we in the current timeline have no idea of. It was also during this time that the Necrontyr encountered the Old Ones, a reptilian Xenos race that was more technologically advanced than the Necrons and which had powers beyond their comprehension. Most importantly, they had extremely long lives and what would make them appear to be immortal, especially to the death-riddled existence of the Necrontyr. It's said that these two species interacted with each other, and the Necrontyr and the Old Ones, being that they were relatively both technologically advanced, and eventually seeing the abilities of the Old Ones, the Necrontyr began to inquire about the secrets to long life and immortality. For some reason, the Old Ones denied the Necrontyr the knowledge of such things. We don't know why this is the case. Whatever the case was, the Old Ones denied them, and this fostered a resentment toward the Old Ones by the Necrontyr. This resentment would be weaponized by the Silent King and used to unite the Necrontyr peoples when he declared war on the Old Ones. Mind you, by uniting the Necrontyr, I mean uniting the royal courts to a common cause, because the citizens of the dynasties had to do what their pharaohs commanded, and they were only really vassals. The resentment towards the Old Ones likely began in the royal courts amongst the lords, the overlords, the pharaohs, and the advisors, who were likely the only people who were allowed to interact with others of power and status. This overall was a big mistake because, as I said before, the Old Ones were more technologically advanced. They had means of faster travel through which they used the psychic webway they created, which meant that they could pop up and assault the Necron dynasties unexpectedly. We can't even imagine the kind of weapons that they had, but let's say that the most powerful weapon that they had was their psychic ability, which the Necrontyr could not counter. Pretty soon, things got really bad for the Necrontyr as they were beaten back to their homeworld in the Halo stars. Being that they were winning the war, the Old Ones really could have wiped out the Necrontyr, so I'm curious as to why they didn't attack the homeworld itself. I'm sure there are a variety of reasons why this could be the case, but the lore has provided one of the reasons, and it says that the old ones were content with letting the Necrontyr eliminate each other at this point, considering them merely a annoyance, which is like condescending as hell. But that's what it was. The scale of this fight must have been a slaughter for the Necrontyr, because as far as we know, it was only the Necrontyr who made it back to their homeworld who were eventually transformed into Necrons during the Biotransference. This probably numbered in the tens of millions, but still, imagine the number of those Necrontyr killed in the war against the Old Ones, and those still fighting as the core forces and surviving royal families of their dynasties retreated back to the homeworld. Like, billions. While back on their homeworld, infighting began again between the dynasties of the Necrontyr. At this period of time, the Necrontyr were susceptible to the influence of the Satan, or the star gods. And this part of the video is where we talk about the Satan. The beings that the Necrons called the Satan, or the star gods, were technically the oldest metaphysical deities in the 40k lore. From what is known of them, they began their existence as quasi-energetic beings that fed off of stars by spreading themselves over the surface of the star and consuming their light, heat, and energies emitted from them, using them to sustain themselves. In the process of doing so, they gained a consciousness of sorts, an ability to move themselves from one star to the next when the previous star they were feeding on died. While they began as primal cosmic energy feeders, they grew to varying levels of intelligence. They didn't really care about the material universe around it. The source of energy that they were really feeding off of took the form of gas or energy, like not the solid form of energy, but like the energy that comes from stars. Accounts are varied, but the Necrontyr detected these beings and sought to use them in their fight against the Old Ones. Here I have another aspect of curiosity, kind of like an interjection here. Did the Satan ever communicate with the Necrontyr before all of this? You know, we know that the Necrontyr were polytheistic and had gods that they worshipped at one point in time. Could these death gods have been the Satan? After all, the baleful star of the Necrontyr homeworld, which killed them over time, did emit enough energy to attract a star god. I don't know. That's just like a question that I have. I guess maybe later on in the video it will be answered. But the Necrontyr used necrodermis to give these cosmic beings physical bodies. And interestingly enough, these physical forms were made in the image of the old Necrontyr gods. So when we look at the miniatures of the Satan, or where we see the artwork of the Satan, we are looking at how the old gods of the Necrontyr were depicted. Thing is, the Satan are not truly gods like how we would automatically assume them to be from the name. They were physical, though mostly energetic beings. They were not gods like the chaos gods originating in the warp and created from the emotions of intelligent species. They were created the moment the galaxy was created. If I could compare, the Satan were more like titans than gods, the embodiments of the forces of nature, or rather forces of the universe, that increased in intelligence over time and developed a consciousness. If any specific force of nature could be said to be embodied by these entities, I would say that it's probably entropy, the ever-increasing degree of disorder in everything, and the eventual end of the universe. Either these beings embodied entropy, or they fed off of it. The latter seems to be the most likely, because in certain places of the lore it does say that the Satan fed off of red giants, which are in essence dying stars. This is likely why so many of these beings were in the halo stars. They were the oldest stars in existence, many of them in their death throes. So being in the halo stars was like a buffet for the Satan. Some accounts say that the Necrontyr had already known about the Satan, that they had detected them using stellar probes and realizing anomalies around dying stars. Some say that the hatred that the Necrontyr had for sentient life after they were beaten back to their homeworld served as a beacon for the Satan that they just could not resist. Regardless, the Necrontyr determined that these beings were of consciousness and constructed bodies of necrodermis for them. Now, once these beings inhabited the bodies made for them, the nature of the Satan changed, or perhaps was revealed. Where before they were primal forces which fed off of stars, now they were able to experience matter in a way that they did not before, and the various forms of energy therein. Because of the power that the Satan had over the physical universe, especially now that they were embodied, the Necrontyr thought them to be the progeny of their half-forgotten death god and began to actually worship the Satan. The energy produced from that worship is something that the Satan began to feed off of. Okay, so the aspect of the Satan that I really want to go over, I really want to hammer in this video, is that the Satan were not the Necrontyr star gods, right? And what I mean by that is the Satan existed millions of years before the Necrontyrs ever did. They existed the moment the galaxy was created, right? These are primal energetic beings. Now, the Necrontyr detected these beings, or detected some of these beings, and made bodies for them. They made vessels for this cosmic energy, and the vessels that they created were in the form of the old Necrontyr gods. And so when I say that the Satan were not the Necrontyr star gods, I mean that literally. I mean the beings, the cosmic energies that embodied these images were not the images themselves. Right, and this is proven by the relationship that the Necrons had with Mephitran. Two of the most common and frequently talked about Satan that we know of in the lore are Azagorod, the Nightbringer, and Mephitran, the Deceiver. Right now, Azagorod, the Nightbringer, is the embodiment of death, and its name appears in ancient Necrontyr writings. So it's like an old god of the Necrontyr, and it might even be the god of the Necrontyr. But that doesn't mean that the cosmic energy that inhabited the image of the Nightbringer is actually the Nightbringer, right? It just so happened that the Nightbringer, or the body of the Nightbringer, was inhabited by a Satan who was also very destructive, right? But this was not consistent. An example of this is the example of Mephitran, which would be known as the Deceiver. The Necrons called this being, this cosmic being, Mephitran, right? Because whatever this being was, it inhabited the image of Mephitran. They called it Mephitran, or because it inhabited the body, but Mephitran actually means messenger, right? It inhabited the messenger. And so the Necrontyr thought that this being was Mephitran and that it would help them. But in reality, the Satan that inhabited this image was malicious, and it's one of the reasons why they became the Necrons in the first place, right? So the point I'm getting at is that the beings that entered these vessels that were created by the Necrontyr did not align with what the gods represented. And because they were so easily deceived by the Deceiver, it showed that the Necrontyr did not truly know the nature of these cosmic beings that they were dealing with. They just fell for the fact that certain cosmic beings entered certain vessels. And so they assumed, okay, so Mephitran, the being entered Mephitran because they related to them the most. And so therefore, Mephitran is the messenger. He's going to help us. You know, like it was kind of like nonsensical. And it makes sense, though, that they began to worship them, because now they thought, okay, so now our gods are real. But in reality, it was more like if I could find a correspondence, I would say like possession, right? We have a human body, and then an evil spirit enters that body, or not even evil spirit. It might just be a regular spirit. We don't know what the spirit is. It enters a human body and expresses itself through the human body. That's exactly what the Satan were. The energies that entered these vessels began to express themselves, and in most cases, that did not align up with what the Necrontyr expected them to be, such as the example of Mephitran. If I can make another example, and maybe I'm breaking the fourth wall here when it comes to like comparing, but I don't know who listening has listened or who has watched it, but Stargate SG-1, right? The main antagonists of the Stargate SG-1 are the Goa'uld, which are these parasites, right? These parasite alien beings that once they enter a body, they imbue that body with powers, right? But they also come with a personality. So the Goa'uld start to express themselves through this person. And so what ends up happening is they end up taking the identity of different cultures and their gods, right? So there's a Goa'uld of Egyptian gods and things of that nature. That's almost like a perfect correspondence to what the Satan did. They inhabited these fake bodies of Necrodermis and they expressed themselves through it to the point where the Necrontyr thought these are actually the gods, when in reality these were primal cosmic beings that didn't really care about them or any other life at all, really. When the Necrontyr encountered the Satan, they gave the Satan the visage of their old gods, blending the myth and the reality of the situation, personalizing it. However, while the Satan or the star gods existed way before the Necrontyr detected them, it was the Necrontyr who gave the star gods physical bodies of living metal, and it is this transmutation that would cause a change in the nature of the Satan, where they would begin to feed off of the energy of living beings. It is in this form of the old Necrontyr gods that countless Xenos species and civilizations encountered the beings known as the Satan. Some began to worship them, and many began to fear them. The Necrontyr are the reason why the image of the Grim Reaper is ingrained in the minds of various species as the image of death, because of the vessel that they created of the Nightbringer. According to information that we have available to us, there are many Satan. At the same time, though, there are many energetic beings who are thought to be Satan when in reality they are just demons or some other phenomena. So we can only say for sure that the Satan are specifically those beings given physical bodies and image by the Necrontyr. There are likely to be many others, but we can't confirm them because they don't fit into that category. And just reasonably, if the Satan existed when the universe existed, if they've existed since the beginning of the universe, all of them are not going to be around the halo stars, around the Necrontyr planet, just waiting to be given a body. You know, there are countless Satan in the 40k universe, but not all of them care about what's happening in the material world around them. Because remember, most Satan were just feeding off of energy from stars. It's only when they were given a body that they started to realize, hey, there's energy and matter too. So there are countless Satan, but there are many that began to associate with the Necrontyr. Azagorod the Nightbringer, Mephitran the Deceiver, Magladroth the Void Dragon, Inforin the Spiral Flame, Yurdathatha the Burning One, Zarhulash the Potentate, Ishudra the Endless Swarm, Langador the Flayer, Agdraida the Arisen, Terranaga the Outsider, and Ingrania the World Shaper are only a few of the Necrontyr Satan that we know of. There are countless others, but these are the ones that interacted with the Necrontyr and through them interacted with the physical universe. And as I said before, most of them were given bodies that were in the image of the old Necrontyr gods. And you know, a thought experiment that I like to do and that I did while thinking about the Satan was, all right, so we know that the Satan inhabited these bodies and interacted with the physical world. I'm curious about the original Necron gods. Like, were they actual beings that the Necrontyr worshipped, or were they representative symbols of the natural forces? I'd like to think that they were just representative symbols of the natural forces and just representatives for certain things, right? And so when I think about that, I think about, okay, so we know Azagorod, the god of death, that represented death. The fact that the Necrontyr had such short lives was embodied, and that's what the image that they created was, of a figure with a hood and a scythe, right? Is a symbol. But then what about Mephitran? Mephitran is probably like the messenger of the gods. It was probably a beneficial god to the Necrontyr at some point. But then I get to like Satan or the Necrontyr gods like Magladroth, right? Because Magladroth is the Void Dragon. And I'm thinking like, maybe in Necrontyr culture, was Magladroth the machine god, or maybe the god of innovation? Was it the god of Necrontyr Crypteks? You know, because if we look at the correspondences made now, Magladroth is the Void Dragon, right? And the Void Dragon is it's supposedly the Omnissiah. So like, is there a connection between innovation and technology and this Necron deity? And what did it represent? A Necrontyr god of innovation and technology, right? And then I think of like Eashudra, the Endless Swarm. Was that deity represented by scarabs or fauna on the planet that had some sort of influence over life and death? I think about Langdor, the Flayer, and I'm like, what force of nature would be a Flayer kind of being? And I'm thinking, what if that god represented radiation? Because like, what does radiation do? It kind of flays the skin, flays the body, and so on and so on and so on. I know it just kind of went on a tangent about like trying to figure out what the original gods represented, but I don't know, this is just how my mind works. But another thing that I was thinking about was the idea of old gods versus new gods. And the reason why I thought this is because the Necrontyr pantheon didn't include every single Satan that was made into existence, but maybe the opposite is true, that as many Satan as possible became part of the Necrontyr pantheon, urged to do so by their embodied kin. Like, what I mean basically is that if the Necrontyr pantheon only had 5 gods, but they have 20 gods or 20 Satan gods now, that means that they actually created more gods along the way, right? So maybe 5 of them represented old Necrontyr gods, and the rest were completely new gods. I don't know why I think like this. I think way too technical. Like, I don't know. I just don't get it. But we're going to continue with the video. After Biotransference, the Necrons took the fight back to the Old Ones with the aid of the Satan in what was called the War in Heaven. I don't really want to go too deep into the War in Heaven in this video, but if I were to sum it up, it was a cosmic war between quite literally the forces of life and death, fought between the immortal, life-creating force of the Old Ones and the deathless, death-bringing force of the Necrons. Because the Necrons were now nearly physically impossible to destroy, the Old Ones had to depend more on psychic powers to fight the Necrons. The Old Ones had their spiritual psychic powers with which they could transcend or escape or travel through reality. However, the Necrons had a mastery of the physical universe and weapons that shattered physical reality and bent the laws of matter. This war was long and devastating, especially for the forces caught in the middle, because eventually the star gods began feeding on other life forms in the galaxy for sustenance, and they used the Necrons to subjugate these species in a lot of cases. The psychic powers of the Old Ones could affect and manipulate physical reality, but they could not control physical reality like how the Satan could. Psychic powers depend on a connection to the warp or the immaterium, and once the Necrons found that out, devices were made to close off the warp in certain areas of space, making it so that psychic powers couldn't be used, or the psychic webway couldn't be used as well. Thus, the Old Ones began to be slaughtered in droves and started losing the war. In response to this, the Old Ones, they began to create new and nurture existing life forms that had or would have psychic potential, who would be able to fight against the Necrons. This ended up creating the Eldar, the Krork, who would eventually become the Orcs, the Jakiro, and many, many other species. This battle happened over such a long period of time that entire new species developed during it. The Eldari, who didn't even exist at the beginning of this war, developed and even had mythologies about the C'tan because they had encountered them in their becoming. And then psychic beings such as the enslavers began to use the psychic species that were created by the old ones as physical portals into the physical world from which they could continue to feed from. This caused issues with the C'tan, who needed life forms for sustenance. And at this point in time, the psychic species were in the majority, still in existence. And then, due to all the emotions going on from the psychic species, warp gods started coming into existence. Honestly, the war in heaven was one big mess. But what is most important in this video is that the Necrons won. They practically exterminated the old ones. After doing this, the Silent King, Zarak, turned on the Star Gods, who had been weakened from the decreased availability of life in the galaxy after this devastating war, destroying many of them and turning many others into shards, or divided pieces of a whole C'tan, which were easier to subjugate. What gave the C'tan power over the physical world was the physical vessels created for them. It is through those vessels that the Necrons controlled and enslaved the Star Gods, and the only way to truly stop a Star God was to destroy the Necrodermis vessel. Once that happened, it was practically neutralized and back to its original form. In this way, the Necrons enslaved the Star Gods, but they still had to deal with the species that the old ones had created in order to fight against the Necrons. And so the Silent King, Zarak, decided instead of continuing to fight these species, just wait until they die. He commanded the Necron legions into the Great Sleep. The tomb worlds of the Necrons were rendered completely devoid of life to avoid attracting the attention of the Eldar or the enslavers, and the Necrons entered the Great Sleep. Now, there are many people, many YouTube hobbyists who can explain the war in heaven in a way better way than I did, and I'll probably include a few links in the comments below. But that's my overview of the war in heaven. But the only reason that I mentioned the war in heaven is because it was during this conflict that the C'tan were subjugated to the Necrons, and we are talking about the C'tan right now. Some, like the Flayer, were destroyed completely, while others were broken into shards, which they practically used as batteries and weapons of mass destruction. Something important to note, though, that every time a C'tan was destroyed or broken into shards, it had a negative effect on the Necrons in some way. I mean, it had a negative effect on reality as a whole, but Necrons specifically, some of which led to the creation of new kinds of Necrons, such as the Outsiders. The Star God that the Necrontyr called the Deceiver was the one that convinced the Necrontyr into Biotransference by using their own material to do so. The irony in this is that the Deceiver did what the Necrontyr did to the Deceiver back to the Necrontyr, which means encasing them in necrodermis and enslaving them to his will. In fact, the Deceiver is the sole C'tan responsible for the idea of biotransference, though inspired by the Necrontyr's desire for immortality and aided by other C'tan. Like, it was the culprit behind biotransference. However, the other C'tan benefited from it as well, as the furnaces of the biotransference facilities were burning hot. The C'tan were feeding off of the energy that was emitted from this. So it's not like they didn't benefit from it, but they didn't start it. It was Mephitran, or the deity that inhabited the image of Mephitran. The Star Gods might have given the knowledge of biotransference to the Necrontyr, but it was the Crypteks who made it a reality, and the Silent King and the Triarch who agreed to do it. And, you know, there was one Cryptek in particular who was like the mastermind of the biotransference, or the one who could make it all happen, and that Necron Cryptek is called Zaraz. Zaraz is a monster, and I'm not going to go too much into his character, but he is a monster. He's comparable to Fabius Bile and Belisarius Cawl. Like, I think every faction has this mad scientist. This Seras is the mad scientist of the Necrontyr species, or the Necrons now. He made it happen, and to this day in the current lore he is still making it happen, which is scary. This guy's a monster. Just look at the model. Like, it's horrifying. So that pretty much sums up my discussion about the Satan. They were not how most people in the hobby now view them to be. Like, they were not the Necrontyr gods. They were just cosmic energies that entered certain vessels, and the Necrontyr took them as the Necrontyr gods. In reality, these were indifferent cosmic forces that were just feeding off a new form of energy, which is wild. And it's kind of scary. It has that cosmic horror theme, and kind of like a grimdark theme for the Necrons. Like, they were fooled, or they were so desperate and so angry about losing against the old ones that they thought these beings would help them, when in reality they were just being used. It's crazy. But next we're going to go into the Necrons. So the Necrons are what the Necrontyr were turned into after the process of biotransference, right? And at least from a physical, visual standpoint, the process of biotransference apparently petrified their bodies into various layers of necrodermis that got rid of any true musculature structure. There is a necrodermis skin, which is a decorative layer of living metal over necrodermis bones, giving the Necrons a overall skeletal appearance. However, there is no necrodermis muscle, as seen in the places on miniatures and in the art where the necrodermis skin has been broken or damaged. It's just necrodermis skin and bones. An interesting point to make is that their vital organs were apparently transformed into pipes and wiring. Like, underneath the necrodermis ribcage of most Necrons, we can see the pipes and wires where the digestive system would have been. And like, these wires are glowing with like an eerie green glow, which suggests that they are powered by some kind of energy. As I said earlier, those higher up in Necrontyr hierarchy retained the most personality and consciousness, meaning that the basic warrior was merely a mindless automata. However, not all Necrontyr wanted to undergo biotransference, with many of the resistance, or much of the resistance, coming from the lower class citizens. Somewhere in the Necron design that caused a dent in the armor that would later be exploited by the Satan. The process of biotransference allowed the Crypteks to advance the technology of the Necrons to such a degree that new weapons were created which helped them to win the war in heaven, along with new physical forms. Necron warriors were made from the lower class citizenry of the Necrontyr, and immortals were created from those of citizens of higher class. And how can we tell that? Because immortals had more free will, even as Necrons, or more awareness or more self-awareness than the Necron warriors. And like I said, the higher you go up the Necron hierarchy, the more they retain their personality and will and intelligence as Necrons. Lychguard always existed. Even as Necrontyr, they were likely chosen from amongst the warrior class. And when I say warrior class, I don't mean Necron warrior, I mean Necrontyr warrior class, meaning the immortals, the current immortal Necrons, to protect nobility. The Tomb Blades were created by the Crypteks as single pilot void fighters near the end of the War in Heaven, so they didn't always exist. I mean, the pilots of those units existed, of course, but the machines did not exist until after the War in Heaven, or during the War in Heaven, near the end of it. Death marks, interestingly enough, had existed in Necrontyr society as assassins of the warrior class, meaning the immortals, right? But they were given specific upgrades which allowed them to be better assassins after the process of biotransference. This is why they have the one eye, and they have the ability to go into pocket dimensions to hunt their prey. This were like upgrades of that role already. Based on their responsibility, it's kind of hard to determine when the Triarch Praetorians were created. I would assume that they were created as a role soon after the Necrontyr dynasties expanded into the galaxy to ensure the influence of the Triarch, and were likely the reason why the secessionists were in the minority during the infighting that was happening during that time. They also ensured that the Necrontyr codes of war were followed by both sides of the conflict. So it's not like they were subjugating one side. It was like, all right, if you guys are going to fight, you're going to fight by dynastic codes. You know, which is like interesting. They preserved the Necron culture. They became more important after Biotransference and were given specific upgrades by the Crypteks as well. Interestingly enough, with these guys, they actually didn't go into stasis when the Necron legions went into the Great Sleep, but instead they preserved what they could from the Eldari, and they traveled the galaxy, influencing primitive cultures to adopt and adhere to the ancient code of the Necrontyr. They quickly became annoying though, because as the dynasties began to awake from the Great Sleep, a host of Praetorians would assign themselves to that dynasty to continue assuring that the ancient Necrontyr codes of war were followed. This became annoying because sometimes they would identify an enemy of the dynasty as a noble or honorable foe, against which certain respect had to be given. For example, not using death marks against other Necron lords, or allowing the enemy to leave a tomb world before war is enacted. Like we hear in the stories all the time of like Necrontyrs, or in bits of lore where the Necrons are like, hey, you guys are living on our world and we're going to give you 3 months to leave, otherwise we're going to fight you. Like, that's part of the Necron code of war. This naturally limited the abilities of the dynastic nobles, despite what they themselves would have liked to do. So while the role of the Triarch Praetorian existed after the expansion, the mechanical Triarch stalkers that they ride upon were created by the Crypteks. Some ancient Necrontyr tools were transformed into tools of war. An example of this is the Ghost Ark. At one point in time, they were made of wood and were used to gather the bodies of the dead Necrontyr on their homeworld, taking those dead bodies to be entombed. And see, that's how we know that there was wood on their world, because that tool was made of wood at one point in time. Then, during the process of biotransference, it was used to gather the severely beaten bodies of the Necrontyr who resisted biotransference. Then, after biotransference was complete and everyone was turned into a Necron, their role changed as tools to gather the damaged Necrons on the battlefield, which could not reconstruct themselves. They were either brought back to a tomb or repaired inside of its hull and redeployed the Necrons right back onto the battlefield. The machines of war of the Necrons were all created by the Crypteks. I'm gonna list them, but it's gonna really just murder my lisp. All right. So annihilation barges, night scythes, doom scythes, doomsday arcs, monoliths, obelisks, tesseract vaults, and the host of canoptek constructs were all created and developed by the Crypteks, and all the units I listed above were given new weapons such as the atom stripping Gauss weapons, the electric like Tesla, and otherwise reality bending power sources. Now, there's also something an idea that I entertain, right? And it's the idea that, the canoptek creatures that the Necrons have, what if those canoptek creatures were made in the design of fauna that existed on the Necrontyr homeworld, right? We look at canoptek scarabs, and we look at canoptek spiders, and we look at all of the canoptek beings that they have. What if the design of those creatures was actually an imitation of creatures that actually existed on the homeworld of the Necrontyr? That is terrifying. Like, imagine like the Necrontyr homeworld was just full of giant spiders. It's crazy. While I do entertain that idea, I don't think I won't go as far as to say that the creatures themselves were put into biotransference, because I don't even know if that would have been allowed. But I do think that they were designed in imitation of the actual creatures. And so when you see a canoptek spider, Just imagine that with flesh and blood and bones, and like it's imitating a creature that actually existed on the Necrontyr world, the same size, just in a technological form and with a technological purpose. Of all the units that I listed, I did not mention two, and the reason why I didn't mention them is because they are considered outsiders or outcasts in the Necron hierarchy. The outcasts are the Necrons who have been affected the most by the destruction, or otherwise reduction into shards, of the Satan. These two units are called the Destroyers and the Flayers. Neither of these units were around in form and function that they currently are when the Necrontyr were stuck on their homeworld, nor did they exist as they do now during the expansion. Both began to form during the War in Heaven. Destroyers are characterized by their objective to annihilate all life. Even the lowliest Necron warrior has this spark, this desire to return to being flesh and blood, but not the Destroyers. They hate all life and wish to destroy it. They don't care about dynastic territories. They don't care about codes of conduct. They barely even care about hierarchy, and that's what makes them outsiders. All they are concerned with is the annihilation of life. They are found in almost all dynasties and emerge almost exclusively from the ranks of immortals, Lichguard, and Deathmarks as a kind of programmed deviation of sorts. Plus, it takes like a degree of free will to turn against life. You to hate life that much. You have to be of the higher ranking of the Necrons. They are useful to all the dynasties still, but they are used as tools, nothing more. And the Crypteks update these models or update these figures with different appendages that will allow them to be better killers, be better at annihilating life. And if we look at most of the Destroyer units, they kind of have this mix of Canoptek creature, and Necron. Like they're like the beastmen of the Necron tier, or the Necrons. They're mixing creature aesthetic with the Necron form, and so it kind of like represents that they're bestial, they're wild, they are the opposite of the royal court that they should be. It is my personal theory that the emergence of the Destroyer could be marked as taking place soon after the Necrontyr expansion, when the Necrontyr were beaten back by the Old Ones to their homeworld again, because it's during this time specifically that they say in the lore that the Necrontyr began to possess an animosity toward all other life that did not exist prior to the expansion. Like before the expansion, they didn't have a hate of all life. It's only after they were beaten back into their homeworld. Remember when I said that destroying the Satan had an effect on the Necrons? I have a theory that the Destroyer archetype came into existence when the Necrons broke the Nightbringer into shards. The Nightbringer was the ultimate annihilator, the god of death, the death of entire worlds. When the Necrons broke the Nightbringer, it broke them too, creating this program glitch, creating the Destroyers. And the fact that Destroyers almost always come from the upper classes of the Necrontyr, I feel like that's like symbolic of like the Destroyers being the highest degree to which a Necron could be. They might not be the noble dynastic or like the royal beings that they intend to be, but I think maybe Destroyers represent the highest form of Necrons as Necrons, just beings who want to wipe out life as a whole. No dynastic drama, no codes of war, just annihilating all life. The second unit that I didn't mention are the Flayers. Unlike with the Destroyers, I don't have to make a theory about like the connection between a Satan's destruction and the Flayers' existence, because it's actually part of the lore. When the Necrons turned on the Satan, they completely destroyed the Satan known as the Flayer. In vengeance, the Flayer cursed the Necrons with the Flayer virus. This virus imbues a sort of madness to the Necrons, where they no longer follow command protocols. Their necrodermis bodies warp into hunched shapes, and they become overwhelmed with the desire to eat flesh and wear skin. being that they are Necrons, they can't really eat anything. So what ends up happening is that the Necron is covered in gore with the attempt to do so. So like they try to eat meat and it doesn't work, and so they end up covered in gore. But they also, their fingers turn into like these flare blades, and they end up flaying their enemies and wearing the flayed corpses of their enemies. The Flayers are like a parody of the Necrons, a mockery of their condition. Earlier I said that there were dents in the Necrondermis armor that were exploited by the C'tan after the Necrons turned against them. The Destroyers are an exploitation of the hate towards life that the Necrontyr experienced after their slaughter at the hands of the Old Ones, right? But the Flayers are an exploitation of the Necrons' innate desire to become creatures of flesh and blood again. And it's ironic because this is why most Flayers emerge from the ranks of the Necron warriors. Remember, the Necron warriors were the lower class citizens of Necrontyr society. Many of them did not want to become Necrons and resisted biotransference, and now this virus makes their existence a manifestation of that, like a visual representation of it. Necron royals fear the infection by the Flayer virus, and the Flayed Ones, as they are called, those who are infected with the virus, are beyond commanding. They are useful, but they're often uninvited because they inhabit a pocket dimension, and they only emerge from these dimensions when the enemy's blood has been spilled. So like, you know how I said earlier, like the Destroyers represent the highest degree that a Necron can become, like a pure Necron could become. I think the Flayers represent the lowest that a Necron could become, a mechanical body that wants to become flesh and blood so much that it tries to consume and to wear the flesh and act like a regular living being when it can't. And it's kind of like, I think these two are some of the coolest Necron casts in the entire armies because they're just horrifying, right? And they're also very pure, you know, like they represent two of the strongest emotions that the Necrontyr had after their first expansion, you know, and I really like that. So the Necrontyr had become the Necrons, and the Silent King had complete control of his peoples who were united under common cause, reforged in near indestructible necrodermis, empowered by devastating weapons created by the Crypteks from knowledge given by the C'tan, and the C'tan, of course, being used as batteries and weapons themselves. Finally, the Necrons were able to take the fight to the Old Ones, and that's what they did. They took the fight to the Old Ones, and they basically beat their asses, right? Just to emphasize a little bit more on the point, the higher in rank the Necron was within the hierarchical structure of the Necrontyr society, the more free will they possessed, though all were in direct subject to the Silent King's will, especially after biotransference. At this point in time, from that point moving forward, the story of the Necrons is actually really the story of Zarak, for he and the Pharaons and the Triarch were the ones in the legions with the most free will, directing the legions and their Pharaons to their objectives. But what ended up happening was before the Great Sleep, Zarak actually removed his own command protocols from his peoples. The lore says that he felt guilty and all this stuff, and I don't really know about that, but what I do know is that he removed the command protocols, and this has had an interesting effect, right? Because there are certain people in the Warhammer community who remind us youngins like me that the Necrons used to be just mindless automata, like, and they were used by the Star Gods, right? And the old lore was bridged with the new lore that the C'tan were using the Necrons, but then the Necrons turned against them, right? But something that kind of changed in the lore was that the Necrons ceased to be just mindless automata. Like, all of them at one point in time were mindless, right? So the way I kind of merge these two narratives together is I say that before the Great Sleep, in that time of biotransference, like after biotransference to the Great Sleep, everyone was under the command of the Silent King to some degree. Like, they all had to follow his command, right? But then after that, after he removed the command protocols, this is when those who are higher up in rank began to realize their old ambitions, began to remember who they were, began to hold on to their status, and began to become passionate creatures. Even if we can say passionate is not really an accurate way of saying that, but like they became beings with personalities, or at least the ones in higher ranking. And so as the dynasties began to awake, the pharaohs began to take form. They began to remember who they were. They began to pursue older ambitions, while everyone else, meaning the lower citizens of the Necrontyr, meaning the warriors and anyone lower than an immortal, was basically a mindless automata. So that's how I kind of bridge the new lore and the old lore. But yeah, so I went over the Necrontyr society and my thoughts on what was possible and how it was designed. I went over the expansion. I went over the ideas I have about the Satan that I'd like to share with people. And then I went over the Necrons. So we're at the last point of the video, which is like a few questions that I had when I was making this this script for this video that I want to go over at the end of this video now. The first question that I had was, did the old ones create the Necrontyr? And I'm like, I don't really know. Either they did create the Necrontyr or they didn't. We do know that the old ones were seeding life throughout the galaxy at certain point. They might have been doing it while the Necrontyr were developing. So it's not really known, and I don't think that's going to be confirmed anytime soon. It's a possibility, but either they did create the Necrontyr or they didn't. Either way, the Necrontyr came into existence. So I don't really know. I would say maybe they did, maybe they didn't. And the reason why I would lean toward maybe they didn't is because of how they responded to the Necrontyr asking for immortality. And this leads to the second question. Why did the old ones refuse the Necrontyr the knowledge of immortality? I mean, I thought of many reasons for this. Kind of feeding off of my answer from the first question that I had, perhaps when the old ones encountered the Necrontyr, they were disappointed in what the Necrontyr had become. Like, if the old ones had created the Necrontyr, we could assume that they had some sort of plan for them. I mean, they had a plan for the Eldari, they had a plan for the Orcs. So if they created the Necrontyr, perhaps they had a plan for the species. And perhaps when they encountered them, they were like disappointed. Maybe the old ones didn't want the Necrontyr to leave their homeworld, and when they found out that they did, they were disappointed. But then I thought, all right, if they did create them and they are disappointed, it has to be more than just, hey, we wanted you to be more than what you are. Maybe they saw the societal structure of the Necrontyr where the royalty had all the power and determined that, hey, if we give you guys immortality, only some of you will have access to it and you'll use it as a weapon of control over your own kind. And if we really think about it, that's exactly what the Triarch did, or that's exactly what the Triarch decided to do with the entire Necron species when they opted to use Biotransference to achieve immortality and gain control of the Necrontyr people like never before. But then I thought even deeper. What if the old ones didn't consider the Necrontyr equal to them because they were not a psychic species? The Necrons, regardless of their technological advances, had not developed into a psychic species like the old ones had. They were a purely mundane species, and circling back to my earlier theory, maybe that would have happened if they never left their homeworld, but for whatever reason, they did not evolve to be a psychic species at this point, and maybe the old ones thought they were unworthy of knowing the secrets of immortality. But then again, all of this can be scratched away because maybe the old ones didn't even create the Necrontyr. Maybe when they encountered each other, the old ones were confused, like, hey, we didn't create you guys, where'd you guys come from? This line of questioning made me ask another question. My third question is, did the Necrontyr have souls? When talking about the Necrontyr becoming the Necrons, the phrase, they lost their souls for the chance of immortality, comes up a lot. But I have a question. If the Necrontyr even had souls, I question this because in other areas of Warhammer 40k lore, the presence of a soul is accompanied by psychic potential and the ability to interact with the warp. On the same wavelength, the absence of a soul is accompanied by the inability to interact with the warp. With most of the psychic species that the Old Ones created, most of them had souls and thus psychic powers. The Eldar had souls and they were psychic, and they also were responsible for the creation of a new chaos god. While it is unknown whether or not orcs had souls because their bodies are basically fungus, they do have a gestalt psychic ability known as the Wa, and they even have their own gods, Gork and Mork, in the warp. Ha, that was clever. Even humanity in the setting have souls and psychic potential and are responsible for the empowering of the chaos gods. However, species such as the Tau have very feeble, very weak souls that barely register to the warp, which leaves them without any psychic powers, but also gives them the ability to not fear the warp, right? They're not really affected by it to an extent. Human blanks make others around them uncomfortable because others can tell that they have no soul. The warp bends and buckles around them and from them. And I'm not saying that all species in the 40k setting have souls or need souls to interact with the warp, examples being the Thousand Suns or even the Chaos Demons themselves. But the Necrontyr never developed into a psychic species. They had not interacted with the warp in their history, or at least from the information that we have, we don't have any evidence that they interacted with the warp in any way before biotransference. Many of the gods of their pantheon likely represented the physical forces of nature rather than actual spiritual entities. And I think questioning whether they had a soul actually kind of supports my earlier theory that the early gods of the Necrontyrs were only representational rather than actual, because if they had worshipped these beings, maybe they would have manifested themselves on the Immaterium or in the warp. But what if they did worship them and couldn't even make that happen because they just don't have souls? Like, they thought the Satan were gods when in reality they were physical forces of nature as old as time. And any energy that was created from the worship of the Satan by the Necrontyr likely involved the generation of physical energy, because the energy of the physical things was what they were feeding off of, what the Satan were feeding off of when they became the star gods, or the Satan, when they embodied the bodies of the old gods. And here's the thing. They only did that because they could not feed off of the warp. They fed off of stars first, and then they fed off of physical matter first after that, but they could not feed off of the warp. And this makes me think, how did the Necrontyr worship these beings? Let's say if they prayed to these beings, does praying generate physical energy? Like, if anything, I think that would make warp energy or be psychic in some way, right? So it could not have been that they were praying to the Satan, because that's not physical energy. However, maybe certain behaviors and activities generated energy that the Satan could feed off of. And you know what this makes me think of? This makes me think of things like self-flagellation and sacrifice. After all, this species was so oriented around death that maybe they thought that sacrificing would appease these deities. Because I can't think of prayer generating physical energy unless it's accompanied by some sort of physical activity. And self-flagellation and sacrifice, maybe like blood ceremonies or burning alive, generates a lot of physical energy. And remember, after biotransference, the Satan, during biotransference, as the flesh and blood bodies of the Necrontyr were being stripped away, Satan were feeding off of the energy that was coming from the furnaces, meaning the burning of these people. The energies that were being created in this process is what they were feeding off of. According to the source, some sources say it's the life energy, some say it's the souls of the Necrontyr, which is interesting, right? Nothing, not even their worship of the Satan, indicates that they had the ability to interact with the warp. Nothing indicates that they had souls either. I'm not suggesting that the Necrons were blanks or had no souls. Otherwise, I feel like the old ones would have been affected by that because the old ones were a psychic species. If the Necrontyr were blanks, I think that would have been detected earlier. Like, I think that if the old ones determined the Necrontyr to be blanks, they would have killed them on the spot, right? I don't think that would have been. I don't think Necrontyr were blanks, but I do think that, like the Tau, they probably had very weak souls and they had the inability to interact with the warp. That was a really long question and answer there. Sorry. I have two more questions that I thought of when I was making this video. Number 4 is, what powered the Necrons? Right? In the lore, the energy that animates the Necrons is described as eldritch and glows with a peculiar green color. And at first glance, we would think that the energy that powers the living metal bodies of the Necrontyr, or the Necrons, is the same energy that they use in their weaponry, which itself is called Gauss. However, the Necrons are not animated by Gauss, and this is kind of repeated throughout the information that we have, like in the codexes. They make a distinction between Gauss and the energies inside the Necrons. So what actually powers or animates the Necrons' bodies? This is unconfirmed by lore and it's merely my speculation. However, to me, I think that it appears that the Necrons are empowered or powered by stellar radiation. The reason why I think this is because dynasties such as the Thoth and the Mefrit and other various minor dynasties illustrate that the energy inside the Necrons of these dynasties is affected by solar energy. The Thoth display azure blue energy, which is sourced from the radiation of the stars, which are blue, above their core worlds, and weaponized for the Legion by the Crypteks. The Mefrit dynasty display the orange energy of stars within them and their weapons, which increases the power of both the energy in their weapons and the Necrons themselves. In the case of Necron immortals, their weapons are attached to them through cabling, providing their weapons with even more destructive power by tapping into the energy within their own bodies. Gauss weaponry breaks down matter and strips away flesh and bone, similar to radiation. According to the lore, when warriors are destroyed on the battlefield, it's a pulse of radiation that is sent out that makes them reanimate themselves. And there are certain Necron nobles who wish, instead of becoming flesh and blood again, they wish to become beings of pure light and energy, right? This means to me that the baleful energy, the green energy seen in the Necrontyr eyes and rib cages, is a kind of stellar radiation which powers the necrodermis bodies of the Necrons. And if we go even further along that line of thinking, being that biotransference happened on their homeworld, that green stellar radiation is possibly the energy from their star. And if that's the case, then it would be even more irony that the star, the energy of the star, the radiation of the star that was killing them when they were Necrontyr is now sustaining their immortal necrodermis bodies. And last but not least, one question that I had that came up, and because it repeated itself so many times in the beginning of this video and in the deep dive that I was doing, is where is the Necrontyr homeworld? Right? Before I give my theory as to where I think it could be, I say that officially I don't think we'll ever know, because there's no point in knowing now that the Necrons are a galactic species. However, if we sift through the lore, we are given clues. Right? The first clue is that the Necrons' homeworld is in the Halo stars. Halo stars meaning it's located at the edge of the galaxy somewhere. In the 8th edition codex entry for the Triarch Praetorians, it says that during the Great Sleep, the Praetorians retreated to the ancient Necrontyr seats of power in the northern fringes, right? So we have Halo region of space in the north. So we have a direction and we have a territory. And maybe it's unmarked, maybe it's unnamed, but I'm just going to share my theory out of like just now, that I think the original homeworld of the Necrontyr people is Drazak, or the Bone Kingdom of Drazak. The Bone Kingdom of Drazak is a tomb world that is inhabited completely of Flayed Ones. So all the Necrons there are Flayed Ones except for one, which is Val Ghul. He's the lord that overlooks this world and all the Flayed Ones. And he does like raid missions to feed these Flayed Ones. I really do think that some of the lore that for Val Ghul and this planet are just old lore, but it's still in the modern lore. It's still something that's still part of this edition of Warhammer and in the current lore. Apparently the Celtic dynasty is keeping an eye on the Bone Kingdom because they don't want the flayers to spread into the Eastern Fringe. Like I said, the nobles fear the Flayer virus, and the Celtic dynasty is one of the most powerful dynasties right now, and so they're keeping an eye there. But besides all of that, the reason why I think that Drazak, the Bone Kingdom, is the original homeworld of the Necrons is because why is it called the Bone Kingdom? Now, of course, it could be called the Bone Kingdom in meaning that the Flayed Ones, when they eat their prey or whatever, they just bring back the bones and it's just covered in bones because they bring their prey back. But what if that the bones, it's called the Bone Kingdom because it is the original world of the Necrontyr. Remember, the Necrontyr homeworld was basically a giant cemetery. Before Biotransference, before the expansion, generations of Necrontyr existed on the homeworld and thus died on the homeworld and thus made the entire world a giant necropolis. What if the bones in the Bone Kingdom of Drazak are the bones of the old Necrontyr? What if Drazak is the original homeworld of the Necrons? And then I think like maybe I feel like that's a reach. I feel like it's truly a reach because now I have to think like why don't they just take it back or whatever. But then I think about certain characters like Oregon and like how like the museum of that Necron and how he collects things and how he likes original Necrontyr pottery. And I'm thinking like, well, why doesn't he just go to that planet? But then my theory kind of pushes back against that because the Flayer virus. Why would any Necron go to a planet that is inhabited or run over by the Flayer virus? An interesting note too, that Val Ghul, he overlooks, he's the lord of the planet. He overlooks all the Flayers, and he has not succumbed to the Flayer virus. Even though he's a noble and he's surrounded by the Flayer virus, he has not succumbed to it, which is interesting. While other Necron pharaons and things of that nature fear it and have succumbed to it in the history of Necrons, he has not. And I think that's kind of interesting. And even though this video is not really like a character-oriented video, I do find that to be interesting. Well, this is the end of my Necron deep dive. I hope that you all enjoyed. I hope that you thought this was informative, entertaining. I hope that it makes you think about possibilities, you know? If you have any other theories, put them in the comments below. But tell me what you think in the comments below as well. And also let me know if you would like me to do like a video about the dynasties that exist now and going over their history. Because if I do a video like that, I'm going to do it from the particular angle that I do, using these perspectives that I presented in this video as a foundation, right? I'm a huge fan of Necrons, and after doing this deep dive, I'm bolstered. Like my enthusiasm, my love of the faction has increased. I'm looking at my force now and I'm just like, oh man, I'm like thinking about, okay, now I have my entire Necron army right now represents a population of a fringe world. Like I'm thinking about it now, like I'm doing organizational stuff now, and I'm really excited to continue building my army. So I hope that you all enjoyed this. If you have a friend who might be entertained by this video, please share it with them. Of course, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. I will be making more deep dives when I'm inspired to make them. After all, this channel is just like a hobby for me. It's an expression of the hobby, so I only really do things that I'm interested in. But I do have some more projects coming up, such as the Data Slates episode that I've been working on, that I released a trailer for. Please watch that, and please watch some of my other deep dives. Explore the channel. Welcome. Welcome to my channel. But without anything else to say, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.